The day Anna Hart buried her father was the same day she found the letter that would change everything, tucked beneath a cracked floorboard in his study, addressed to a man named Wallace Thatcher in the territory of New Mexico. A letter her father had written but never sent, asking a stranger to take care of his daughter when he was gone. The year was 1873, and the frontier town of Creek, Texas, sat baking beneath a relentless July sun like a copper penny left on a stove. It was the kind of place where the dust settled into the creases of your hands and never fully washed out, where the wind carried the smell of cattle and sage, and the faint memory of rain that had not come in weeks. Anna had grown up in Creek, had watched it grow from a scatter of shacks into something that called itself a proper town, with a general store and a livery, and a church whose white paint peeled in long strips every summer as if the heat itself were trying to undress it. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair the color of river mud after a storm, and green eyes that her father had always said were the one thing he'd done right in his life. Her hands were rough from years of working the small homestead they had kept together since her mother died of fever when Anna was 11. She knew how to mend a fence, how to load a shotgun, how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. What she did not know was how to be alone. Her father, Thomas Hart, had been a quiet man, the kind who kept his worries folded up small and stored away where they wouldn't trouble anyone. She had found the letter on the morning after the funeral, when the neighbors had gone home and the casseroles they'd left were growing cold on the table. She had been looking for the deed to the property, because she knew that without it she had nothing solid to stand on, and instead she had found 3 pages of her father's cramped handwriting tucked inside a dried-out envelope. She sat down right there on the study floor and read it. Her father had known Wallace Thatcher through correspondence, through a shared acquaintance who had moved west some years before. Thomas had apparently written to this man about everything, about the homestead, about Anna, about his failing health, and in this last letter he had written something that made Anna's hands go still. He had written, "I do not ask this lightly. My daughter is capable and stubborn and braver than she knows, but this land is harder on a woman alone than it ought to be, and there are men in Creek who will not see her fairly when I am gone. I am asking you, Wallace, to come. Not to rescue her, she would never allow it, but simply to be there. She needs someone steady, and from everything I know of you, steady is what you are." Anna read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, set it on the table beside the cold casseroles, and stared at the wall for a long time. She did not know this man. She did not know if her father had ever actually mailed a previous version of this letter, or whether Wallace Thatcher even knew she existed. But the deed to the property was not where it should have been, and when she went to the county office the following morning, the clerk, a thin man named Gerald Pratt who always looked slightly embarrassed to be doing whatever he was doing, informed her that there was a lien on the Hart property, filed 3 months ago, by a man named Hector Dunn. Hector Dunn was the wealthiest man in Creek. He owned the saloon, the grain mill, and 3/4 of the grazing land to the south. He had been trying to buy the Hart homestead for 2 years, and Thomas Hart had refused him every time. Now Thomas Hart was dead, and it seemed that Hector Dunn had moved faster than a rattlesnake. In the same moment, his rival fell silent. Anna walked home with a cold, precise anger sitting in her chest like a stone. She sat at the kitchen table with the unfinished letter in front of her, and she picked up her father's pen, and she finished it herself. She added a postscript in her own handwriting, explaining that Thomas Hart had died on the 14th of July, that she had inherited the property and had no intention of leaving it, and that she would be grateful for any assistance or advice this Mr. Thatcher might offer, if he was the kind of man her father believed him to be. She sealed it, paid the postmaster, and waited. 3 weeks later, in the thick heat of August, a rider came up the road to her homestead in the late afternoon. She was in the garden when she heard the horse, and she straightened up and shielded her eyes against the sun, watching the figure come closer. He was riding a dark bay horse, a well-kept animal with a steady gait, and he sat in the saddle the way a man sits when riding is as natural to him as breathing. He was tall, that much she could tell, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare, and when he stopped at the gate and tilted his head back to look at the homestead, she caught her first good look at him. Wallace Thatcher was 30 years old, lean and sun-browned, with dark eyes that moved over everything with the quiet attention of a man who had learned to read the land the way others read books. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stubborn red rock that jutted up out of the New Mexico desert, and a mouth that suggested it did not smile easily, but when it did, it meant something. He wore a plain cotton shirt, trail dusty from weeks of riding, and a single-action Colt revolver at his hip that he wore the way working men wore tools, not for show, but because it was useful. He saw her and pulled his hat off, holding it against his chest in a gesture that was so instinctively respectful that Anna felt something loosen slightly in the knot she had been carrying since her father died. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, carrying the faint echo of somewhere in the southwest, not quite Texas. "My name is Wallace Thatcher. I received your letter." "I know who you are," she said, pulling off her gardening gloves. "You came a long way." "Your father was a good man," he said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of any performance in it, struck her somewhere beneath the ribs. "And his letter was not the kind you ignore." She looked at him for a moment in the hot amber light of the afternoon, this stranger her dead father had trusted enough to write to, and then she nodded toward the house. "You can water your horse at the trough," she said, "and then you should come inside. I have a legal problem and I suspect I am going to need help." He followed her inside without ceremony, and she made coffee on the iron stove while he sat at the kitchen table and read the notice from the county clerk, and the lien document she had since obtained a copy of, reading every line carefully with the patient attention of a man who understood that paperwork was as dangerous as a loaded gun. "Dunn filed this while your father was sick," he said when he had finished. "I know. Does he have any legitimate claim on this land?" "None," she said, pouring the coffee and setting it in front of him. "My father never borrowed from him. The property was paid free and clear in 1865, and I have the original deed. The lien is false." But the county clerk is afraid of Dunn. The judge rides in from Amarillo only twice a year, and without someone to stand up in front of that judge and argue my case, I have nothing. Wallace wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at her across the table. She had the feeling he was measuring something, not her exactly, but the situation, the weight of it, the shape of what would be required. "I'm not a lawyer," he said. "I know, but you're not afraid either, I can tell." Something shifted in his expression so briefly she almost missed it. "What makes you say that?" "My father trusted you," she said. "He was a careful man. He didn't trust people who were afraid." Wallace looked down at the coffee, and for a moment the kitchen was quiet except for the distant lowing of the cattle in the south pasture and the tick of the stove cooling. "I'll stay," he said, "if you'll have the help." "You can use the barn," she said, because the proper thing was to be clear about arrangements from the beginning, and because she was a woman alone and could not afford to be careless about appearances in a town like Calla Creek. "There's a room at the back. I've kept it clean. You'll need it." "That's fine," he said. He slept in the barn that first night, and the next morning he was up before dawn fixing the section of fence along the north pasture that had been leaning badly since the spring, and that she had been managing to hold together with rope and stubbornness. She watched him work through the kitchen window while she made breakfast, watched the efficient and unhurried way he moved, and thought that whatever her father had known about this man, he had not been wrong about the steady part. The days fell into a pattern after that, the comfortable working rhythm of a homestead that had two people tending it instead of one. Wallace took on the heavier repairs without being asked, mended the roof where it had started to leak, restrung the fence wire along the full eastern boundary, and spent 2 full days working on the water pump that had been giving trouble since spring. He did not make her feel rescued. He made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone was sharing the weight. But the problem of Hector Dunn did not wait for them to find their footing. On a Thursday morning in the second week of August, Dunn himself rode up to the Hart property with two of his men flanking him. He was a broad man with the red complexion of someone who drank more than was good for him, and the assured bearing of someone who had never in his life been told no by anyone who could enforce it. He wore a good hat and a good coat, and the expression of a man who had already decided how a conversation would end. Anna came out onto the porch to meet him, and Wallace stepped out from the side of the house, where he had been working on the barn door, and stood just off to one side in a way that was quiet and unobtrusive, and yet somehow made the geometry of the encounter entirely different. Dunn looked at Wallace for a moment with the calculating discomfort of a man recalculating odds. "Miss Hart," he said, settling his attention back on her. "I heard you had company." "I have hired help," she said. "What brings you out here, Mr. Dunn?" "Business," he said pleasantly. "I've got a legal lien on this property. I came to discuss terms. There's a fair price on the table for you, and I think if you're sensible you'll take it before the judge comes through and you end up with less than fair." "That lien is fraudulent," Anna said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "My father owed you nothing, and I have the documents to prove it." Dunn smiled in the way of men who had confused patience with power too many times to stop now. "Well, the courts will decide that." "But courts take time and money, and a woman running a place like this on her own, well, it's a difficult thing." "She's not on her own," Wallace said. His voice was entirely mild. He had not moved from his position, had not put his hand anywhere near his gun, and yet the two men flanking Dunn both shifted slightly in their saddles in the way that horses shift when something changes the quality of the air. Dunn looked at him again, more carefully this time. "And who are you, exactly?" "Someone who knows a fraudulent lien when he reads one," Wallace said, "and who plans to be standing next to Miss Hart when the circuit judge comes through Amarillo in October." The pleasantness left Dunn's expression like smoke off a doused fire. He looked at Anna and then back at Wallace, and then he gathered up his composed manner the way a man picks up a hat that has blown off in the wind and put it back on with an effort. "October is a long time away," he said, and then he turned his horse and rode away with his men behind him, which was not a threat exactly, but was not nothing either. After they had gone, Anna let out a long, slow breath. "He's not going to leave this alone," she said. "No," Wallace agreed. "He isn't." They stood on the porch for a moment together in the silence left by the departing horses, and Anna became aware, in a way she had been carefully not becoming aware of for 2 weeks, of how close Wallace was standing to her, and of the particular quality of being near someone who was simply, in some fundamental way, on your side. She went inside to make lunch. She did not say anything else about it, but something had shifted and they both knew it. The weeks that followed were full and difficult and strange in the particular way that a life shared between two people who have not yet named what they are to each other is strange. They worked side by side through the long August days. Wallace rode into town with her when she needed to go to the general store, not hovering but present, and the people of Calla Creek, who were not blind, began to draw their own quiet conclusions. Some were kind about it. The widow Mrs. Calloway, who ran the general store with her son, always greeted Wallace warmly and gave Anna an extra measure of flour without being asked. The Reverend shook his hand on a Sunday morning after service and said he was glad to see the Hart place in good hands. Others were less kind or more complicated. A woman named Marjorie Fenn, who had made it her business since Anna's adolescence to have opinions about Anna's choices, cornered her in the dry goods aisle one afternoon with a face full of concern, and said that she did hope Anna was being careful about appearances, having a young man staying on her property like that, and that she only mentioned it because she cared, which Anna understood to mean that she was going to mention it to everyone she knew regardless. Anna thanked her politely and bought her flour and went home and said nothing to Wallace about it. But that evening, while they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the sun drop behind the western hills and painting everything the color of old bronze, Wallace said without preamble. People in town are talking. People in town are always talking, Anna said. Does it bother you? She thought about it honestly. It bothers me less than being alone would, she said. And that's the truth. Wallace was quiet for a moment. The first stars were beginning to show in the east, the way they always showed in Texas, tentatively at first and then all at once, like something that had been waiting for permission. Your father wrote to me about you more than once, he said. Anna turned to look at him. She had not known this. He said you were the most determined person he had ever known, Wallace continued. And he said it the way a man says something that makes him proud and also gives him a worry both at the same time. That sounds like him, Anna said softly. He worried about what would happen to you if he was gone. He knew about the lien. He knew Dunn had been watching the property for years. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you to carry it. Anna felt something tighten in her throat. I would have preferred to carry it, she said. I would have preferred to know. I know, Wallace said. But he loved you the way people love things they are afraid of losing, carefully, maybe too carefully. She did not answer right away. The night was cooling the way Texas nights did in August, going from furnace to something almost gentle in the space of an hour. What did he write to you about himself? She asked finally. He wrote that he was dying, Wallace said simply. He wrote that the land was good and the woman who would inherit it was better, and he asked me to come and make sure no one took either of them from her without a fight. He paused, and he said he hoped I would stay. The last sentence landed between them with a particular weight. Anna looked at her hands in her lap, the rough, capable hands that had never been pretty and never needed to be. And do you, she asked, plan to stay? Wallace was quiet for so long that she looked up at him. He was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to associate with him, that quality of a man who has considered a thing from every angle before he speaks. Yes, he said, if there's something here worth staying for. She held his gaze for a moment in the dark. Then she looked back at the stars. I expect we'll find out, she said. She went to bed that night with her heart beating a little differently than it had before. September came with its first tentative hints of mercy, the nights cooling properly now, the brutal edge going off the daytime heat. The homestead was in better shape than it had been in years, the fences mended, the roof sound, the pump running cleanly. The cattle were doing well in the south pasture. Anna had always been a decent manager, but there was no denying that 2 pairs of hands changed the arithmetic of a working homestead in ways that mattered. She and Wallace had developed the kind of easy, wordless communication that people develop when they share work and space over weeks. A tilt of the head that meant the south fence, a look that meant check the water trough, a particular silence that meant something that neither of them had put language to yet. One afternoon in the first week of September, they rode into Calla Creek together to meet with a man named Jeremiah Cross, who was a land agent and the closest thing to legal expertise available until the circuit judge came through. Cross was a small, precise man who wore spectacles and had the tired eyes of someone who had been trying to do honest work in a dishonest landscape for too long. He looked over Anna's documents with careful attention, spreading them on his desk and going through them with a pencil. The lien is clearly fraudulent, he said after a long time. Your father's deed is clean. There is no recorded transaction between Thomas Hart and Hector Dunn. None. He looked up over his spectacles. The question is whether Dunn has gotten to the court records. Can he do that? Anna asked. He shouldn't be able to, Cross said. But Dunn has money and Dunn has connections, and what a man shouldn't be able to do, and what a man can do in this territory in this year are sometimes different things. Wallace leaned forward. What do you need from us to take to the judge in October? Cross laid out a list. Affidavits, original documents, a record of the property's history, and testimony from anyone who had witnessed the Hart family's clean ownership of the land over the years. He explained what the court proceedings would look like, the questions Anna would be asked, the arguments Dunn's people would make, and how to counter them. Anna listened to all of it with the focused attention she brought to everything, turning each piece of information over in her mind, storing it. When they left Cross's office an hour later and stepped out into the dusty street, she felt for the first time since her father died that the shape of the problem was something she could actually hold, something with edges she could work with. They walked to the general store for supplies, and then to the livery to pick up a harness Wallace had left for repair, and the afternoon had the comfortable quality of a day's work done together. It was outside the livery, while Wallace was settling up with the liveryman, that Dunn's man found them. Not Dunn himself, but a young man who worked for him named Cooper, lean and dark, and with the manner of someone auditioning for a meaner version of himself. He planted himself in the street in front of Anna with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and said that Mr. Dunn had a message for her, which was that the offer on the property was going down 10% every week she refused it, and that she might want to consider her situation before October. Anna looked at him with the flat, direct gaze she had been perfecting since adolescence. "Tell Mr. Dunn that his offer isn't going anywhere because I'm not accepting it at any price," she said. "And you can tell him that Miss Hart sends her regards." Cooper's expression shifted in a way that was less pleasant. He started to say something else, but Wallace had come out of the livery by then, and he stepped up beside Anna in that quiet, unhurried way he had, and whatever Cooper had been planning to say, he thought better of it and walked away. Wallace handed Anna the newly repaired harness without comment. "Thank you," she said. "You were handling it," he said. "I know," she said. "But it's nice not to have to." He looked at her sideways, and the corner of his mouth moved in what she had learned was as close to a smile as he usually got in public. Something warm moved through her chest. They rode home in the long slant of September afternoon, side by side, and Anna thought that whatever this was between them, it was gathering the way weather gathered over the western hills, slow and certain and building towards something inevitable. The next 2 weeks were a time of preparation, and something else running underneath the preparation like a current under ice. They gathered the documents Cross had asked for, riding out to speak with the 2 oldest families in the valley who had known the Heartland since before Anna was born, and who gave their testimony willingly and without hesitation. Old Ben Mercer with his cataract-clouded eyes, signing his name with a hand that still knew what it was doing. And the Calloway widow, who had kept a record of every transaction in the store since 1858, and who found 3 receipts in Thomas Hart's name that dated back to the first year he had broken ground. In the evenings they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and went over the documents together, preparing the arguments the way a general prepares a campaign. Anna was sharp and thorough and pushed back when she thought Wallace was wrong, which happened twice, and both times he considered her argument and then said she was right, which she found she respected enormously. On a Wednesday evening in the middle of September, they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp burning low between them, and Anna was reading back through a piece of testimony while Wallace cleaned the lamp glass, and the domestic quiet of it settled around her with a warmth that she had not felt in this house since her father had been alive. She looked up from the papers and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, going back to the lamp glass. "Just thinking." "About what?" He set the glass down and looked at her across the table. The lamp light was soft and amber, and it made his face look less guarded than usual, more open to the world. "About how your father described you," he said, "in his letters, and how different it is actually knowing you." "Different how?" "Better," he said simply. Then, as if he had surprised himself with the word, he picked up the lamp glass again and began polishing. "He was right that you were determined. He was right that you were brave, but he didn't tell me about the other parts." Anna put down the testimony. "What other parts?" Wallace was quiet for a moment in a way that told her he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking. "He didn't tell me you were funny," he said, "or that you could argue an argument from 6 different angles without losing the thread, or that you sing when you're working and you don't know it." He paused. "He didn't tell me it would be like this." The lamp flame moved in the draft from the window, making the light shift between them. Like what? Anna asked, and her voice was quieter than she intended. Wallace looked at her with those dark level eyes, and something in his expression had changed, the careful composure giving way to something more unguarded. Like something I wouldn't want to be without, he said. The kitchen was completely still. Anna felt her heartbeat in her throat, in her hands, in the too warm air between them. Wallace, she said, and it was not quite a warning and not quite an invitation, and was, she realized, both. He stood up slowly from the table and came around to her side, and he stood in front of her, and she stood up to meet him, and they were very close in the small, warm circle of lamplight, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from years of squinting into a bright western sun. He lifted his hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the careful gentleness of a man who was not sure he was allowed this, and was asking with the gesture itself. She turned her face into his hand slightly, just slightly, which was the answer. He kissed her gently, and she kissed him back, and the kitchen filled with something that had been building since the first afternoon he had ridden up her road and taken his hat off. They stood like that for a long moment, and then drew back and looked at each other in the lamplight with the slightly stunned expression of people who have arrived somewhere they had been traveling toward without knowing it. "Well," Anna said, because she needed to say something, and that was what she had. Wallace's mouth curved into a real smile, the kind she almost never saw. It did extraordinary things to his face. "Well," he agreed. She laughed, a small surprised laugh, and he caught her hand and held it, and they stood like that in the kitchen while the lamp burned quietly between them. Outside, the Texas night was wide and full of stars. October came, and with it the circuit judge. Judge Harold Waverly came through Calla Creek in the first week of October, a rail-thin man in his 50s, with the dry, precise manner of someone who had adjudicated an enormous number of arguments in an enormous number of dusty towns, and had been made neither cynical nor sentimental by it. He set up court in the back of the church, which was the largest indoor space in Calla Creek, and worked through his docket with quiet efficiency. The Hart property case was on the third day. Anna had slept badly the 2 nights before, not from fear exactly, but from the particular tension of a thing you have prepared for as thoroughly as you can and must now simply do. She wore her best dress, a dark green wool that had been her mother's and that she had let out at the seams twice as her frame had filled into her own shape, and she braided her hair and put it up properly, and she looked at herself in the mirror over the washstand and decided she looked like a woman who owned her land. Wallace was waiting for her in the kitchen with coffee and the document case under his arm. He looked at her when she came in, and something moved in his expression that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. Then, because it was true and because she was a woman who had decided in the last 3 weeks to say the true things when they mattered, "Thank you for all of this." "You did most of it," he said. "We did it," she said, which was also the true thing. He held the door open for her and they walked to town together. The church was more full than Anna had expected. Hector Dunn was there with his lawyer, a man brought in from Amarillo named Whitfield who had a city suit and the manner of someone who considered this particular assignment beneath him, but would do it thoroughly anyway. There were at least 40 townspeople crammed into the pews, because a land dispute involving Hector Dunn and a young woman standing up to him was the most interesting thing to happen in Calla Creek in months, and small towns ran on their drama. Anna sat at the table before the judge with Wallace beside her, not as her lawyer but as a witness, and, she thought, as someone who would be there if the table shook beneath her. Dunn's lawyer Whitfield went first, laying out the claim of the lien with the smooth, professional ease of a man who had made arguments like this many times, implying without quite stating that Thomas Hart had taken an informal loan from Dunn years ago, that records were lost, that gentlemen's agreements were difficult to document, and that Miss Hart was a young woman new to legal matters who might have misunderstood the nature of her father's financial obligations. Anna sat completely still through all of it and felt the anger in her chest burn clean and cold like a blue flame. Then she presented her case. She had practiced. She knew every document. She laid them out before Judge Waverly one by one. The original deed from 1865, the county records of her father's clean title, the 3 receipts from the Calloway store, the signed testimonies of Ben Mercer and 2 other long-standing neighbors, and the affidavit from Jeremiah Cross confirming that there was no recorded transaction between Hart and Dunn anywhere in the county records. She was concise and clear and completely unintimidated. Ben Mercer testified in person, his old voice carrying clearly through the church, that he had known Thomas Hart for 20 years and had never once heard him speak of a debt to Dunn or to anyone. Whitfield cross-examined with the professional skepticism of his trade, but there was nothing to find, because there was nothing there. The lien was a fabrication, and the documents proved it, and the judge was not a man who could be persuaded by implication when evidence was before him. Judge Waverly deliberated for less than an hour. He returned to the table with his lined face arranged in the same neutral expression it had held all morning, and he voided the lien, confirmed Anna Hart's full and unencumbered ownership of the Hart property, and added a note to the record that the filing of a fraudulent lien was a matter the county attorney might want to investigate. Hector Dunn left the church without looking at Anna. The room erupted in the restrained but genuine satisfaction of a community watching something fair happen, which was not so common an occurrence that it went unappreciated. Mrs. Calloway embraced Anna hard enough to creak her ribs. Jeremiah Cross shook her hand with both of his. Old Ben Mercer patted her arm and said her father would have been proud, and she managed to hold herself together right up until he said that, and then she had to look at the ceiling for a moment and breathe carefully. Wallace stood just behind her through all of it, patient as the land itself, and when the congratulations had run their course and the church was beginning to clear, she turned and found him watching her with an expression she had no vocabulary for yet, something clear and warm and certain. "You did that," he said quietly. "We did that," she said again. And then, because the church was mostly empty now and the afternoon light was coming through the plain glass windows and setting everything in gold, "Come home." He looked at her, understanding the word she had used, the particular claim in it. "Yes," he said. They walked home in the October afternoon, and the air smelled like the coming of autumn, like dry grass and turned earth, and the first faint cold promise of the season changing. The homestead sat at the end of the road in the afternoon light like something solid and certain, the fence lines neat, the roof sound, the garden going brown and gold in the season's turn. Anna stood at the gate for a moment and looked at it. "It's mine," she said, not to Wallace exactly but to herself and the air and whoever might be listening. "It's yours," he agreed, standing beside her. She took his hand. He folded his fingers around hers and they stood there a moment, looking at the home she had kept and he had helped her keep, and then they went inside. October deepened into November, and the homestead moved into the quieter rhythms of the off-season. The garden was put to bed, the cattle moved to the closer pasture, the fences inspected for the winter. The days were shorter and the evenings came down early and cold, and the kitchen fire became the center of the house, the place where they ended up at the close of each day. They were careful with each other in a way that was different from distance. They had come to an understanding in the kitchen 3 weeks ago, and it had changed the texture of everything between them, had opened a new kind of ease and a new kind of tenderness that neither of them had quite known what to do with at first, and were now finding their way into carefully. They talked in those evenings, really talked, the long, unhurried kind of conversation that only happens when 2 people are not in a hurry to be anywhere else. He told her about New Mexico, about the land he had worked there, about a period of time after a drought when he had ridden with a cattle drive up into Colorado and had seen the Rockies for the first time and had not had words for what that was like. He told her about his parents, both gone now, his father from a fall from a horse when Wallace was 17 and his mother from the grief of it, or what felt like the grief of it, 2 years later. He told it without drama, the flat, factual way of someone who had made peace with the shape of their losses. She told him about her mother, which she had not talked about to anyone in years. About the way the fever had come on quickly, a Tuesday well and a Sunday gone, and how Thomas Hart had become someone slightly different after it, not diminished, but quieter in some way he had never quite recovered from. About being 11 years old and understanding, for the first time, that love was something that could leave a wound in its going. "Is that why you didn't marry before?" he asked. She thought about it. "Partly," she said, "and partly there was never anyone who seemed worth the risk." He looked at her across the fire. "And now," he said. She looked back at him and did not look away. "Now is different," she said. He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and held it, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the fire burned steadily in the grate. On a cold, clear Sunday in the middle of November, Wallace Thatcher asked Anna Hart to marry him. He had been thinking about how to do it for weeks. He was not a man given to elaborate gestures, and he suspected that Anna would not want one anyway, that what she would want was something real and direct and without performance. So he did it in the morning in the kitchen before the day had started, when she was still in her house dress with her hair loose, and there was coffee on the stove and everything was ordinary. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Anna, I want to marry you if you'll have me. I want this to be my home, and I want you to know I'm not going anywhere." She was standing at the stove. She turned around and looked at him, and for a moment her face held something he could not quite read, and then it resolved into something luminous, something that he thought he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. "You're not just asking because of the property business being settled," she said. "I'm asking because I've been in love with you since approximately the second week of August," he said, "and I was just trying to figure out how to say it without frightening you off." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and she reached up and put her hand against his face, and she said, "Wallace Thatcher, I've been in love with you since you came around the corner of my barn and stood next to me while Hector Dunn was trying to make me feel small. Yes." He kissed her in the kitchen with the coffee going on the stove and the morning light coming through the window, and it was not the first time they had kissed, but it was the first time it had this particular quality of beginning, the specific quality of a door opening onto something long. They were married in December in the Calla Creek church on a day that had turned unexpectedly mild, the way Texas days sometimes did, like the weather was making an exception for something it approved of. Mrs. Calloway cried. Jeremiah Cross stood as a witness. Old Ben Mercer was there, and beamed throughout the whole ceremony with the concentrated delight of a man who has lived long enough to see the right things happen. Anna wore a dress she had made herself from a cream-colored fabric she had ordered from the general store, with small buttons at the wrists and a collar trimmed in lace she had found in her mother's cedar chest. She had braided her hair and coiled it and put her mother's small pearl earrings in her ears, and when she walked down the aisle of that plain white church toward Wallace Thatcher, who was standing at the front with his eyes on her and only on her, she felt as though she were walking towards something she had always been meant to arrive at. He said his vows in his steady, unhurried voice, and his hands around hers were warm and solid. She said hers clearly, without trembling, looking him in the eyes. The Reverend pronounced them married in the sight of God and the assembled population of Calla Creek, and Wallace kissed her with a tenderness that made someone in the pews sigh audibly, and then they turned together to face the room. Outside afterward, in the mild December sunlight, with the town gathered on the church steps and the air smelling of pine smoke and cold earth, Anna stood in the circle of her husband's arm and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as peace. Not the absence of difficulty, not the promise that nothing would ever go wrong again, but the solid, specific peace of knowing that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. Winter closed around them, and the homestead became the kind of warm interior world that cold weather makes of places that are properly tended. Wallace had built a new shelved wall in the kitchen for storage, and had spent 3 full days reinforcing the barn against the season's worst winds. And the cattle were sound, and the wood pile was high, and Anna had put up enough preserved goods in the fall to carry them through without worry. They learned each other in the particular and intimate ways that people learn each other when they are sharing a life. His habit of reading by the fire until long past when he should have been asleep, and the faint ink stain on his right hand that never entirely went away because he wrote more than he let people see. Her way of standing at the kitchen window in the morning with her first cup of coffee, looking out at the land before the day started, as if taking a reading of it. His ability to coax an animal's confidence with an almost uncanny patience. Her talent for knowing without asking when someone needed to talk and when they needed silence. They were good together. Not in the effortless way of people who have never challenged each other, but in the deeper way of people who had looked clearly at each other and chosen anyway. January came with a proper freeze, the first hard one in years, and they weathered it side by side. The cattle needed extra tending, the water troughs freezing over each morning, and they took turns going out in the dark before dawn to break the ice. And there were mornings when they did it together, bundled in their heaviest coats, breath clouding in the lamplight, and something about those mornings in the cold dark felt to Anna like the truest picture of what a marriage was. One evening in late January, when the freeze had finally broken, and the first tentative thaw was making small rivers of the drainage ditches, Anna told Wallace something she had known for 3 weeks but had been turning over in the privacy of her own understanding. She told him over supper, setting down her fork and looking at him across the table and saying simply, "I think we're going to need a bigger cradle." He looked up from his plate. The expression that moved across his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. A kind of unguarded astonishment that gave way almost instantly to something so warm and whole she had no word for it. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both of her hands in his, and he looked up at her with those dark, steady eyes filled with something she had never seen in them before, something that was purely wonder. "Anna," was all he said. Apparently August was a very significant month, she said, and laughed, and he pressed his face against her hands and shook with a laughter that was also something close to tears. Spring came with its long, slow exhale of green. The homestead came alive in the season's return, the garden turned and planted, the pastures brightening, the sound of birds coming back to the trees along the creek. Anna worked in the mornings when her energy was best and rested in the afternoons, and Wallace had quietly reorganized the heavier tasks without making a production of it, simply ensuring that the things requiring lifting and straining were done before she got to them. She told him once that she was not made of glass, and he said he knew that perfectly well, and then he went back to being thoughtful about it without apology. She had been annoyed, and then charmed, and then given up trying to be annoyed. He wrote letters, she discovered, long ones, to the acquaintance through whom he had first known her father, and to 2 old friends in New Mexico, and one day in March he received a letter that made him read it twice before he set it down. "What is it?" she asked. "Lucas Bran," he said. Lucas was the friend from New Mexico, the one who had introduced Wallace and her father by correspondence years ago. "He's moving north. He's asking if we have room for a few weeks while he settles." "Of course," Anna said. Lucas Bran arrived in April. A big, good-natured man of 32 with a weathered face and laugh lines cut deep at his eyes, riding a spotted horse and leading a packed mule. He was easy company, the kind of man who made himself useful without being asked, and told stories in the evening that made everyone laugh. He looked at Anna with the frank and friendly curiosity of someone who had wondered about the woman who had made Wallace Thatcher stay put after a lifetime of moving. "He wrote good things about you," Lucas said on his second evening, when Wallace had gone out to check the horses. "He wrote good things about you too," she said. "I introduced them," Lucas said, with a satisfaction that suggested he considered this one of his finer achievements. "Your father and Wallace. I knew they were the kind of men who'd understand each other." Anna was quiet for a moment. "Did you know what he was planning, asking Wallace to come?" "No," Lucas said honestly, "but I'm not surprised. Your father was a man who thought ahead, and he was right." He looked at her with the evaluating clarity of an old friend. "Wallace is different, settled. I've never seen him like this." "Like what?" "Happy," Lucas said simply. Anna looked out the window at the evening sky over the property she had fought for, and felt that word land gently in her chest where it belonged. Lucas stayed 6 weeks and helped with the spring cattle drive they made to the market town 20 miles north, which they had been planning for months. It went well, better than the year before, and the return took them 2 days riding easy. And on the second afternoon, with the homestead visible at the end of the road, Wallace rode close beside Anna and said quietly, "Good spring." "Good spring," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and they rode the last quarter-mile like that, hand in hand, unhurried. Lucas left in May with many promises to return and genuine warmth, and something in his manner when he said goodbye to Wallace, that was the particular warmth of two people who have known each other through enough that they don't need ceremony. The summer grew round and full. The garden was the best Anna had ever had, partly because she had Wallace's help for the first time, and partly because the rains had cooperated. She learned she had inherited her father's green thumb, but had never had quite enough time or help to use it properly. In July, exactly 1 year after Thomas Hart had been buried in the Calla Creek churchyard, and Anna had found the unsent letter under the floorboard, their son was born. It was a long labor, attended by the town's midwife, a capable and calm Comanche woman named Rosa, who had delivered half the children in the valley, and who had won Anna's complete trust over the preceding months. Wallace was not in the room, as was proper, but he was in the kitchen, and Anna could hear him walking the floor steadily in the measured rhythm of a man keeping himself composed through will alone. When Rosa brought the baby out, wrapped in flannel, and held him up to show the father, Anna heard from the bedroom the particular silence that is not the absence of sound but the presence of something too large for words, and then she heard Wallace's voice, low and rough with something she had never heard in it before. "Is she all right?" he said first, always her first. "She's fine," Rosa said, "tired and fine. Come meet your son." The name they had agreed on was Thomas for her father. Wallace brought him to Anna, who was lying propped against the pillows with the specific exhausted triumph of a woman who has just done the most difficult and extraordinary thing, and he set the bundle carefully in her arms and sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her, and they looked at their son together. Thomas had dark hair and a face that was currently screwed up in the indignant expression of someone who had not anticipated this particular change in circumstances. He had Wallace's brow and possibly Anna's chin and the overwhelming new person perfection of all babies. "Hello, Thomas," Anna said softly. The baby opened his eyes, unfocused and dark, and seemed to consider her. Wallace's arm tightened around her. "Hello," he said to his son in that steady voice, and the word had in it everything a voice could carry. The years that followed were the years of building. Hector Dunn, after the judge's ruling and the county attorney's subsequent interest in his business practices, found himself considerably less powerful in Calla Creek than he had been. He sold the saloon in the spring of 1875 and moved to Amarillo, which suited Calla Creek admirably. The news traveled through town, with a satisfaction that people tried to moderate, and largely failed too. The Hart homestead, which had always been good land, became in Wallace's steady hands and Anna's clear management something that earned its own reputation in the valley. They were known for honest dealing and good cattle, and the particular quality of welcome that a home has when the people in it are genuinely glad to be there. Thomas grew from a squinting bundle into a toddler with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and then into a small boy who followed Wallace around the homestead with devoted and occasionally inconvenient dedication, wanting to help with everything regardless of whether help was useful, and who sat on the porch with Anna in the evenings, and listened with enormous attention to whatever she was willing to tell him about the stars. In 1876, Anna gave birth to their daughter, whom they named Martha after Wallace's mother. Martha was born with Anna's dark hair and a personality that announced itself loudly from the first moment, leaving no one in any doubt about who was running the room. Wallace was besotted with her in a way that amused Anna deeply, this composed and measured man reduced to complete capitulation by a small person who had decided he was her favorite. "You know she's going to run everything," Anna said, watching him carry the baby around the kitchen one evening. "Good," he said, without hesitation. "Things could do with better management." Anna threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it one-handed while keeping Martha perfectly steady, which was an impressive piece of coordination, and grinned at her with the full, unhurried smile that still, 4 years into their marriage, did something specific and agreeable to her pulse. Thomas was 3 when they expanded the house, adding 2 rooms to the north side. Wallace did most of the work himself over the summer, with Lucas Brand back for a second long visit and helping through the heavy construction days, and 2 men from town who were reliable workers and who approached Wallace with the easy respect that the valley had developed for him over the years. Anna watched the rooms go up with a feeling she could not entirely name. She had kept this house through the worst year of her life. She had held it against a man who had tried to take it with false papers and a woman's supposed inability to fight back. She had found love in it when she had not been looking for love. She had buried her father from it and married a husband in it and brought her children home to it. And now it was growing, room by room, into something larger than it had started as, which was, she thought, exactly what a home ought to do. The summer of 1877 was a good one for the valley: good rain, good grass, good markets, and a general sense that the wild and unpredictable quality of the frontier years was slowly giving way to something that had the feel of permanence. Towns were getting telegraph wires. The railroad was pushing closer. The world was changing with the particular momentum that the late 19th century had, full of its own confidence and direction. Anna was not naive about what that change meant for everyone. She knew that the Comanche people of the region had been through a period of devastating loss in the years following the Red River War of 1874, forced onto reservations under conditions that were unjust and brutal. Their land taken not with false liens, but with the full machinery of the United States government, which was, she thought, a different scale of the same fundamental wrong she had faced and had been lucky enough to defeat. Rosa, the midwife who had attended the births of both her children, had family who had suffered through it, and Anna had sat with her more than once and listened to what that suffering had looked like from inside, and had felt the weight of it and the injustice of it in a way that changed how she moved through the world. She gave what practical help she could. She was not a woman who had power in the governmental sense, but she was a woman who had a voice in the community, and she used it when she could, which was not nothing, even if it was not enough. The autumn of 1877 brought the second expansion of the Hart homestead in a different sense. A word-of-mouth reputation that had been building steadily turned into something formal when 2 young families looking to settle in the valley came to them asking about land. Wallace had, over the previous 3 years, quietly acquired 2 adjacent parcels of land that had been abandoned after their owners moved on, paying fair price at each county auction, and now the question was whether to sell or to lease. They talked it over at the kitchen table on several evenings, going back and forth with the honest disagreement they had always been capable of, which was one of the things Anna valued most in their partnership, the fact that he never agreed with her simply because she was his wife, and she never deferred to him simply because he was her husband. They decided to lease, at fair rates, to families who would work the land well. It was Wallace who went to the county office to file the paperwork, and Anna who drafted the lease agreements, and they sat across the kitchen table from the 2 young couples, one from Missouri and one from East Texas, and went over the terms together with the careful honesty of people who had been on the other side of a dishonest agreement and knew what it cost. Thomas, who was 6 by this time, sat in the corner during one of these meetings with a piece of slate and a chalk, drawing something with great concentration. Afterward, when the couple had gone, he held up the slate to show them a drawing of the house with 2 stick figures in front of it that he identified as Mama and Papa, and a third smaller figure he said was himself, and then he had added 2 more figures off to the side that he explained were the new people. "The new people are in the picture," Anna said. "They live on our land now," he said, with the reasonable logic of a child for whom this required no further explanation. Wallace met Anna's eyes over their son's head, and the look between them was the kind that needed no translation. The winters grew easier as the homestead grew stronger. There was money enough to hire 2 hands during the busy seasons, and the cattle operation had expanded to the point where it was a real enterprise rather than a subsistence keeping. Anna managed the books with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, and the numbers told a story of steady accumulation, not wealth in the way of Hector Dunn's grasping kind, but the deep-rooted solid kind that came from honest work and clear judgment. Martha, at 2, developed an obsession with the horses that occupied the entire Hart family for the better part of 6 months. She was too small to be around them unsupervised, but supervising her when she wasn't around them was almost as demanding, because she would simply take herself to the paddock fence at every available opportunity and stand there looking at them with an expression of pure yearning. Wallace finally solved the problem in the only practical way, which was to begin teaching her, holding her carefully on the back of the most patient mare in the string, and walking the paddock while she sat with the focused and thrilled expression of someone who has at last gotten exactly what she wanted. Anna watched from the fence with Thomas beside her, and felt something so complete and warm it was almost too much to contain. "Papa's teaching Martha to be a cowgirl," Thomas said, with the mix of amusement and admiration that older siblings develop. "I think Martha was always going to be a cowgirl," Anna said. "Your father is just helping it along." Thomas considered this and nodded in the way he had, a gesture very like his father's, the slow gravity of it. "Are you a cowgirl?" he asked. "I'm a rancher," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it, a particular quality that made Thomas look up at her. "There's a difference. A rancher owns the land." He looked out at the pastures, green in the spring light, running to the tree line along the creek. "Our land," he said. "Our land," she confirmed. The summer of 1878 brought news from the east, carried on the telegraph wire that had reached Calla Creek the previous year, a full account of the proceedings of the national political scene, the approaching end of Reconstruction, the changing shape of the country. Wallace was a man who read newspapers when he could get them, and had opinions that he kept moderate in company but spoke plainly at home, and Anna shared both the reading habit and the directness. They argued sometimes about politics the way they argued about everything else, with complete honesty and the willingness to be changed by a good argument. It was one of the things she had come to love most about him, that he was not a man who had fixed himself in place mentally, who kept his mind open the way he kept his hands ready, available for whatever was needed. Lucas Brand came back for a 3rd visit that summer, and this time he came with news of his own, a woman he had met in Colorado, a schoolteacher named June with a dry sense of humor and a mind like a good steel trap, and he spent most of the visit talking about her with the helpless enthusiasm of a man who had surprised himself by falling in love. Wallace listened to this with the private satisfaction of a man who recognized the specific quality of what his friend had fallen into, and said very little beyond the occasional well-placed question that allowed Lucas to talk himself into understanding what he already knew. "He wants to marry her," Anna said to Wallace one evening after Lucas had gone to bed. "I know," Wallace said. "He just doesn't know how to say so." "He'll get there," Wallace said. He did. Lucas wrote to them from Colorado in October with the news that he was engaged, and the letter had about it the particular quality of a man who has found his footing in a new kind of life and is grateful for the solid ground beneath his feet. Anna wrote back a letter full of genuine happiness and good counsel, and Wallace added a postscript that was only 2 sentences, but that, Anna suspected, contained more of what men say to each other than the longer texts allowed. October brought the anniversary of the court ruling that had given Anna her land back, and she marked it privately, the way she marked all the significant things, by walking the property line in the morning before the household was up, as she sometimes did, touching the fence posts at the corners and looking at the land in the early light. Wallace found her at the east boundary when he came out to start the morning chores, and stood beside her in the October air that smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves. "Thinking about your father," he said. "Always," she said, "this time of year especially." She put her hand in his and they stood looking east, where the sun was coming up over the flat horizon in a long, low wash of amber light, painting the pastures gold and the sky the specific soft blue of a Texas October morning. "He would have liked you," she said. "He would have been insufferably pleased with himself for thinking of it." Wallace smiled. "I liked him," he said. "From his letters, he was an honest man." "He was," she said, "and he did one last honest thing. He didn't try to solve the problem himself. He admitted he couldn't and he asked for help." She paused. "It took me a while to understand what a brave thing that was." Wallace looked at her sideways. "For a man like him," she said, "who never asked for anything, to write that letter, to say, 'I cannot do this alone,' that was the bravest thing he did." She felt Wallace's hand tighten around hers. They stood together in the October morning, the land spreading out around them in the early light, quiet and wide in theirs, and the years already lived and the years still coming were both present in the moment, the weight and the gift of a life that had been built carefully from what it was given. "What do you want?" Wallace said quietly. "For the next 10 years, what do you see?" She thought about it in the honest, thorough way she had always thought about things. "Of this," she said finally. "The children growing, the land thriving, Lucas and June coming to visit, maybe another child if we're lucky." She paused. "I want Thomas to know this land the way I know it, the way my father knew it, not just as property but as something alive that you have a responsibility to. And I want Martha to know that she can do anything she can dream up, because she is going to dream up things that will terrify and delight us in equal measure." Wallace laughed softly. "And you?" she said. "What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the light on the grass. "I was moving for a long time," he said, "after my parents were gone, not unhappily exactly, but without direction. I didn't know what I was looking for." He paused. "And then your father wrote to me and I came here and I found something I didn't know I'd been looking for." He turned to look at her. "I want to stay here. I want to be here for all of it. Every October morning and every hard winter and every good spring. I want to be standing right here next to you when Thomas has his own children and Martha rules the known world." Anna laughed, and the sound of it went out into the quiet morning air. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on their land in the October light. The years opened and folded and opened again. Thomas learned to ride before he was 8, and to read before he was 6, and developed a passion for maps that led him to spend hours drawing the territory in chalk on the barn wall, with a focused absorption that was entirely his mother. Wallace found him doing this one Saturday afternoon, and instead of telling him to wash it off, went to the room where he kept his books and brought out an old surveyor's map of the county that he had been given years ago and could not bring himself to throw away, and laid it out on the barn floor, and spent the better part of the afternoon teaching his son how to read it. Martha learned to ride before she was 4 because the alternative was letting her attempt it without supervision. She had Wallace's steadiness on horseback, which was saying something, and Anna's fearlessness about new things, which was saying something else entirely, and the combination made for a small person who was constantly in the process of attempting something that made the adults around her simultaneously proud and breathless. She also, at 5, announced that she intended to learn to read now, and sat down at the kitchen table with Thomas's primer and the focused determination that was entirely her mother's, and by the end of the following month had worked her way through it cover to cover. The schoolteacher who came to Calla Creek in the spring of 1879 and opened a proper school at last met Martha Thatcher on her first day and wrote home to her family that there was a child in the valley who was going to be famous for something. She was not yet certain what. In 1880, Anna gave birth to their third child, a second son they named William, for no one in particular, just because they liked the name. What was a sunny, easy child who seemed to have emerged from the womb with a contentment about the world that neither of his more intense siblings had ever demonstrated, and he smiled at everything and everyone with a guileless warmth that made him, from his earliest months, impossible not to love. "He's going to be the easy one," Anna said, watching him sleep. "After the other two, we've earned him," Wallace said. She threw a pillow at him gently in deference to the sleeping baby. By 1882, the Hart homestead was one of the most respected working ranches in the valley. The two families who leased the adjacent parcels had prospered and had sent two more their way, and the informal arrangement had grown into something with the feel of a small community centered on the Thatcher land, which was what people in the valley now called it, the Thatcher land, though Anna had never changed the deed and never intended to. "It's the Hart homestead," she said, when someone called it the Thatcher place in her hearing. "It's both," Wallace said. "It's Hart land," she said. "My father's name is in the ground here." He understood. He had always understood. She talked to Thomas about it one evening when he was 10, sitting on the porch in the summer dark, telling him about his grandfather, about the way the old man had broken this ground and kept it and loved it and in the end had trusted it to her. "And then he trusted someone to help you," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. "Papa," he said. "Your father," she said. "Though when he first came I didn't know he was going to be that. I just knew he was someone I could trust." Thomas considered this with the slow gravity that was so entirely his father. "How did you know?" he said. She thought about the afternoon on the porch with Hector Dunn, about the way Wallace had stepped out from the side of the house and stood there, quiet and unassuming and entirely certain, and about the particular thing that changed in the geometry of the moment when he appeared. "He didn't try to take over," she said finally. "He stood beside me. That's different from standing in front of someone. When someone stands beside you, it means they trust you to handle your own part." Thomas looked at the dark outline of the pastures, the cattle moving in the distance. "I want to be that kind," he said. "You will be," she said, with a confidence that came from knowing him. He was quiet for a moment. "Mama," he said, "are you happy?" The question came with the particular directness that children have when they are asking the important thing plainly. She looked out at the land in the summer night, at the homestead her father had built and she had kept, and they had all made into something more together, at the lights from the kitchen where Wallace was putting Will to bed, and she could faintly hear, through the open window, his voice going through the counting song that Will demanded every single night. "Yes," she said, and it was simple and complete and entirely true. "I'm very happy, Thomas." He nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said, and then leaned against her side with the comfortable ease of a child who has known a long time that this is a safe place to be, and they sat together in the summer dark, while the stars came out one by one over the Texas sky. The anniversary of Wallace's arrival at the Hart homestead was a day Anna quietly noted every year. Not with ceremony, but with an awareness, the way you notice the anniversary of anything that changed everything. On the 10th anniversary in the summer of 1883, she told him at breakfast. The children were not up yet. Will, who was 3, could sleep through anything. The older two were old enough to sleep late when the summer allowed it. 10 years, she said, putting coffee in front of him. He looked up. "You arrived on an August afternoon," she said, "and you took your hat off and I thought you had honest eyes." He was quiet for a moment, his hands around the coffee cup in the way he had. "I was terrified," he said. She looked at him. "Not of the situation," he said. "I dealt with worse situations, but your father had written about you for 2 years and I was." He paused. I'd built an idea of you from the letters, and I was afraid of what it would mean if the reality didn't match." "And did it?" she said. He looked at her across the morning kitchen, 10 years of mornings behind them and all the mornings still ahead of them, and the slow, certain warmth in his eyes was the same warmth she had been watching grow from the very first evening. "It was better," he said. "It was so much better." She sat down across from him and took both his hands in hers across the table and held them. Outside the kitchen window, the August morning was gold and wide and already warm, the same heat and light and smell of grass and sage that had been present on the day. A rider came up the road on a dark bay horse and stopped at the gate and tilted his hat back and looked at her homestead as if he was seeing something he'd been looking for. The land was good. The cattle were sound. The children would wake in a few hours hungry and full of their plans. Martha had announced 3 days ago that she intended to learn to rope, and Thomas was already drafting, in the manner of a careful older brother, a lesson plan that would keep her from hurting herself in the process. Will would wake up in his sunny, uncomplicated way and announce that he was hungry and needed breakfast and possibly a song. And Wallace Thatcher, who had come on a dead man's faith and a daughter's desperate letter, and had found something neither of them had expected, would spend the day as he spent all his days, beside her, steady and present and entirely hers. Anna turned his hands over in hers and looked at them, the rancher's hands, marked by the same years of work as her own, and then she looked up at him. "I'm glad he wrote to you," she said. "I'm glad you finished the letter," he said. She smiled, and he smiled, and outside the August morning spread itself out over the Hart homestead, over the mended fences and the sound roof and the good pastures, and the 2 parcels of leased land where decent families were building their own lives, over the churchyard where Thomas Hart's grave was tended and marked with a proper stone, over the road that ran into Calla Creek, where the county clerk's office held a deed with Anna Hart Thatcher's name on it, free and unencumbered, exactly as it should be. They sat together in the kitchen while the coffee cooled and the morning brightened, and neither of them was in a hurry to let it end. The years ahead were full and certain, the children growing into themselves, the land growing into its best expression, the 2 of them growing into the long, slow comfort of a love that had been built rather than fallen into, brick by careful brick, from honest work and honest words and the particular grace of 2 people who had chosen each other clearly and kept choosing. It was all of it still ahead of them, and all of it already real. The morning held them in its light, and the homestead held all of them, and the land held the homestead as it had always done, as it would always do, patient and wide, and enduring under the Texas sky.